Hello, welcome to Magic Circles in the Skies and today's episode. But before we begin, I'd like to give thanks to all the people that have liked, shared, and subscribed, and to newcomers. This is very much appreciated and helps to support the channel. Now, for today's episode called The Goblin and the Huckster by Hans Christian Andersen, which I've renamed as In Denial of Beauty. The structure will remain the same, starting off with a summary where I'll digress in a few highlighted sentences, give an interpretation or reflection with my pearls of wisdom. We'll move on to my critical review on how I see this fairy tale plays in today's society and its relevance. There will be a parallel to this critical review using a film to compare and contrast. And then we'll move on to the last but not least, my trigger point and the close with my quote. And now for today's episode, which is called The Goblin and the Huckster, which I've renamed as In Denial, which is a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen that tells the story of a cunning goblin who lives with his huckster and his wife. The huckster is a door-to-door salesman who owns a shop on the ground floor of a house while a student lives in a garret and attic room above. I digress. The goblin obviously sees some value in living with the huckster. Interpretation. The story explores themes such as the value of art and culture, materialism, and the human condition through the character of the goblin. The story illustrates the struggles between the pursuit of intellectual and spiritual fulfillment and the desire for material comforts, a struggle that is relevant to readers even today. My pearl of wisdom. This reminds me of people in society who want to shine bright like a diamond, but aren't willing to be pressed. One evening, the student visits the shop to buy candles and cheese. While there, he discovers a piece of poetry on a paper wrapping the cheese. The huckster offers to sell him a book full of poetry for sixpence, and the student agrees, leaving the cheese behind. I digress. The book of poetry is more intriguing than the cheese, I guess, spiritually more nourishing. Later that night, the goblin, feeling angry at the student's earlier comment that the huckster knows nothing about poetry, takes the huckster's wife's tongue and grants her the ability to speak to various objects in the room. They all agree they understand poetry better than the student. Really? I digress. Humiliating a huckster for a lack of culture and ignorance was a grave mistake on behalf of the naive student. Interpretation. The story highlights the power of poetry to elevate the human spirit, as seen in the student's room, which is transformed by the poetry book into a space of beauty, light, and music. It's also emphasized the importance of preserving art and culture as the students chooses to save the book of poetry instead of buying cheese. My pearl of wisdom. I believe art, creativity, and culture are all deep expressions of the spirit. Curious, the goblin visits the student's room and peeks through the keyhole to find him reading the poetry book. I digress. So, why is the goblin going to such great lengths to spy on the student, since they've already decided that the goblin, his wife, and the huckster knows more about the student, more about poetry than the student? The room is filled with light, beautiful visions, and music, which deeply affects the goblin. I digress. The goblin is moved by the student's cultural taste and feelings evoked from poetry. He wishes to stay with the student, but decides against it as the student has no jam, which the huckster does. I digress. How trite. Interpretation. The goblins struggle to choose between the intellectual and spiritual fulfillment offered by the student and the material comforts provided by the hucksters mirrors the choice humans face in, in their lives. This theme is illustrated by the story's closing lines, which state that humans are the goblin visiting the huckster because of jam. This suggests that people often prioritize material gains and comfort over intellectual and spiritual enrichment. My pearls of wisdom. What's really interesting is the goblin reflects us as a human in society and how we're willing to trade creature comforts for the nourishment of the soul. Later, a fire breaks out in a nearby house, and everyone rushes to save their most prized possessions. I digress. Could it be our greatest treasures are within us? The goblin saves the poetry book and realizes that it's the most valuable thing in the house. I digress. Yes, this is true if only we knew how to use the treasures within the book. He considers staying with the student, but ultimately decides to remain with the huckster because of jam, symbolizing the human tendency to choose material comforts over the intellectual and spiritual pursuits. I digress. Coming back full circle to the goblin's ulterior motives, he wanted to have his cake and eat it too, without making the sacrifice of embracing the changes for the idealism he so admired in the student. Interesting. Interpretation. The goblin and the hucksters presents a reflection on the choices we make in life, the value of art and poetry, and the human tendency to prioritize material possessions and comforts over intellectual and spiritual growth. My pearls of wisdom, coming full circle, how the intangibility of our spirit and soul are the true treasures beneath the flame of life. Very interesting. I found this fairy tale. And now we're going to go on to my critical review on how I see this fairy tale plays in today's society. I found this fairy tale to be really fascinating. It described how characters struggle with the same issues back in the day, which are relevant not only in today's society, but I think since the beginning of time. The huckster is a man with a small business selling everyday essentials like food as fuel to live off as we go about our daily routines called life. But the goblin is torn between the two worlds of highlighting the kind of conflict between materialism and idealism, especially when a culturally sophisticated but poor student enters the scene. The goblin is unconsciously forced to reflect on things he wouldn't dare give himself permission to think about. For example, how the spiritual nourishment of the soul is more fulfilling than the sweet comfort food, which only lasts for a short while. The goblin loves the beauty of poetry. The student's attic is cold and unfriendly. However, the goblin doesn't want to give up the warm, comfortable environment of the shop. He, the goblin, can't even imagine how the peace and comfort of delicious words can transform our minds by helping us dwell in our own sanctuary of peace within us. therefore providing us with the safety and protection from the poisonous reality of today's society. Comfort doesn't require the effort that words do in order to reframe how we see and think about things. Everybody wants the brass ring, but nobody wants to work for it. Comfort provides the ease, whereas the poor student represents the hard work and material scarcity individuals are too afraid to deal with. The hypocrisy of the goblin exposes the struggles we as being ex, humans beings experience most of our lives. However, people who have been challenged to go through spiritual awakenings, for example, or alike, are held to higher standards. I could give several examples of the hypnotic pull of money and spiritual power, the hypocrisy that exists. There are religious institutes, churches, etc., who preach against the obsession of money and materialism while greedily holding onto the purse strings of the tithes offered by the parishioners. Unfortunately, the running of the church has become like a corporate business. This has changed the true intention of what the pillars of the church originally stood on in terms of spiritual connectivity. In terms of spiritual connectivity, it barely exists because they can't wrap their heads around the fact that what it is in spirit, intangible belief, wisdom, hope, and faith. It's not rational. It can't be explained into existence or academics. So they hypocritically laugh at spiritually led people and put them down for not being rational and logic religious robots. It hasn't been easy, but I have made inroads with my tiny mustard seed of faith. Now we're going to move on to the parallels of a film called The Shape of Water. And it gives a parallel and a comparison to this fairy tale. Here's why it works so well. The goblin in Hans Christian Andersen's tale represents hidden sensitivity and artistic depth, just like the sea creature in The Shape of Water, who is misunderstood, othered, and nearly destroyed by the world that values control, appearance, and dominance. The huckster is the practical, commercial minded man who cannot appreciate poetry or inner beauty. In the film, this is mirrored by the authoritarian Strickland, obsessed with power, order, and surface appearance, blinded by the richness of the creature's soul. The girl and the goblin's connection echoes Eliza's bond with the creature. Both are silent, both express themselves beyond language, both find salvation in love, imagination, and the world outside the grasp of rationalism. The film, like the fairy tale, affirms that true beauty and meaning often lie where the world refuses to look. And that's on the inside, people. The fairy tale expresses and talks about what is truly valuable. Soul, poetry, and beauty is often overlooked by those who seek only to profit by control. The film's true connection is empathy. Beauty exists beyond speech and surface and are threatened by the system that seeks to express commodity and to commodify them. And it continues giving all these different comparisons. So there's loads of different comparisons, but they're very, very similar. And basically come back to the same thing. We are pulled as human beings by materialism, by law and order, what people say is right, what people say is right, but not what they feel or know to be right. It's very, very different. And so this is why I found this particular fairy tale so interesting. In both stories, the world of order and profit sees nothing in poetry or mystery. But when someone bears witness with love, silence, or imagination, what's hidden becomes radiant. What's hidden becomes blindingly obvious. What's hidden becomes something that cannot be denied anymore. And last but not least, we're going to move on to my trigger points. Now, the trigger points for me in the fairy tale are related to my religious experience with the church's obsession with money hidden behind the tithes for the sake of the church. In short, you could have donated 25 years of money, and the moment you really need support from the church, they are either reluctant to help you or won't help you at all. I know of someone that left the church for the same reason. A family had tithed for about 30 years, going to this particular church in the United States. Sometimes they would donate money at least 2 or 3 times a week because they would go to service. They never asked for anything except one time his sister was experiencing unbelievable difficult times. She asked the church as the last resort to help her, and they simply said no. After so many years of his family personally giving to support the church, and this woman's brother walked away. He just walked away from the church. I don't think he gave up the spiritual value of the spirit, but he walked away from the corporate entity of the church, which I think has become a business of compassion, not a compassionate business or a place that operates from the space of genuinely wanting to help people. My second example is more personal. I had gone through 5 very hard towers falling around me during the time between September 2021 and July 2022. I had lost my home, my mother died, my cat died, who was my only family because I had a terrible relationship with my mother. And I had breast cancer. They caught it in time. I had my bank account was emptied and I lost my job. And it was just a very difficult time. There was no one to help me as usual. I became my own rescuer through the Spirit of the Holy Spirit, God, and myself were pulling things together and making it possible for me to experience victory in my life. When I had my operation, I asked the church, heaven forbid, I asked the church if someone could come with me. This woman happened to be friends with the pastor's wife, who also had cancer in 2020, with the support of thousands of people praying for her, while I did not have any support at all. And let me just say, she wasn't particularly helpful, the woman who was friends of the pastor who came to the hospital. While in the hospital room, I was getting dressed and putting my bandaged bosom into my bra. And I heard her say, well, was it malignant? So I said, yes, it was. And she said under her breath, of course, she didn't think that I could hear it, but I could hear it. And she said, well, thank God I don't have to deal with that. And at first I thought, well, maybe she was, just, you know, thinking and, didn't think that anybody could hear what she said. But it turned out she continued to talk about the situation as though I was invisible. She continued talking about, oh, and Brandy went through such a terrible time, and the recovery period is awful, etc., etc., etc. And I had finally, Spirit said to me, you have to say something. So I did. I said, I have a very strong constitution and I have powerful regenerative cells, which turned out to be a blessing for me because that's exactly what the Holy Spirit used when I had to go for radiotherapy. And I went into radiotherapy. I came out. I didn't smell like smoke. I didn't have one burn scar on my breast, which was a miracle in itself. And what was interesting, I left the church and I left Spain and I went to go and live in Canada for 14 months. And during that time, I had the stronger part of my spiritual awakening. But what was interesting, I came back in October of 2023. So I was there for 14 months. I came back and the pastor's wife, she just completely ignored me. She sort of like ghosted me, actually. There were times when I wanted to say, well, I listened to your sermon. It was very good. And she would just stare through me like I was a ghost. She completely ignored me. Then one day, out of the blue, which was so interesting, she suddenly, one Sunday, shoved her face, most unfriendly, shoved her face in my face and asked how I was. Well, I recognized that she didn't want to ask that. She basically wanted to know how I did it. I was expected to fail. I wasn't expected to recover. They didn't, this is why they decided not to help me. They decided not to support me while she had thousands of people praying for her. They just ignored me. Well, she wanted to know, how did you do it? And I almost wanted to say to her, well, if you have to ask and you're in the house of God, something's amiss. And what was interesting, her question was a confession, a crack in the facade of religious performance. How are you? Which was code for, how did you do it? I exposed the quiet tragedy of modern ministry. Many who claim to dwell in God's house that have forgotten his voice. She depended on the system of thousands of supporters for her miracles and designated mediators, people that stand in on her behalf. I simply had the Holy Spirit. What her question really revealed, she operates as a proxy faith based on authority within the church, not based on the authority of the Holy Spirit. She used miracles mediated through systems, prayer chains, altar calls, and approved theology. Mine was in direct line with the Holy Spirit, depending on Holy Spirit, depending on ritual over relationship. That's what she was doing, depending on the ritual, but not the relationship. Pardon me. She doesn't recognize the Spirit's hand. If she truly witnessed God move, she'd have recognized his fingertips on my healing. But she didn't want to even see it. She didn't want to recognize it. She was too angry. She was mad because she was in competition. This was a competition for her. And she feels as though she didn't win in the end. Instead, she was confused like a chef who can't identify salt. Her ministry is a job, not a journey. You overcome through desperation and encounter. Yes, it's the desperation when you say, I have nobody to turn to. God wanted that to happen to me. It was like he was tired of me constantly trying to lean on other people, not lean on myself and not lean on him. And he made it so. He goes, she's going to have nobody to lean on, and it's going to be me. And I did through desperation and encounter. She's trapped in an administration and expectation. Her question proved she's auditing miracles and not participating in them. And so that was the hypocrisy there. A lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of people in the church, it becomes a job. It's just a job and administration, but they're not as sincere when it comes to spirit in the way that they like to present themselves as being. So anyway, that's today's episode and the end of the episode. And I'm just going to leave you with my quote. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening.